all to this 106th session of Mero Eye Talks webinar. Today, as a guest, we have a very special speaker, Dr. Shrikant Bharadwaj, and he will be talking on topic how the spot the difference can be treated using binocular vision. Before he begins, I would like to give a general introduction. Dr. Shrikant is a director at Holden Institute of Optometry and Vision Science. He is also a scientist, professor at Holden Eye and Research Center, Albicesar Eye Institute, India. I welcome you, Dr. Shrikant, on the behalf of Mero Eye Foundation and all our participants.
Thank you, Solu. So, should I get started?
Yeah, doctor.
Okay. So I'm going to just share my slides with you guys. Just let me know if the slides are visible, and I'll put it on full screen mode. Right. Are my slides visible and am I audible?
Yeah, doctor, it's visible and you are perfectly audible to us.
All right. Well, thank you, Solu, and the Mero Eyes Eye Talk organizers. I think this is a wonderful thing what you guys are doing, and I learned just a minute ago that this is the 106th talk. So this is fantastic, and I keep seeing the advertisements for the different talks that is happening, and I think several of my colleagues from the Prasad Eye Institute have also given talks in this. So once again, I feel honored to be presenting in this forum, and I also congratulate all the organizers for putting up such a fantastic show. It is Sunday evening, 8 o'clock, and I have no idea how many people are listening to this, but I hope that I do not disappoint you or bore you with whatever I'm going to be talking about. What I will talk for maybe the next 25-30 minutes or something like that is about a project that we had done here at the Institute, and it is a very special project as far as I am concerned, and I'll tell you why that is the case in just a minute. The title of the project is How Can the Spot the Difference game be cheated using binocular vision? Now, the reason why, and along with me, the people who really did all the work, or rather it's a work in progress, so they are doing all the work, are Kavita Venkatramanan, Swanandi Gavde, and Amit Hattibalagal. All of them belong to the Holden Institute of Optometry and Vision Science at the L. V. Prasad Eye Institute. So these are the faces to the names that I just mentioned. Both Kavita and Swanandi were our postgraduate diploma in optometry and vision science PGD OVS students. Kavita belonged to the first cohort and Swanandi belonged to the second cohort. They have done remarkably well with this project and in general with the training otherwise also. So partly I am talking about their work and also sort of advertising how they went about doing this project and what all they learned as a part of the PGD program. Amit is a postdoctoral fellow with us. Amit finished his PhD at the Queensland University of Technology in color vision, and he has joined us, and he is currently set up a color vision clinic at the institute and also doing a lot of research related to color vision and retinal functions in general. So all these three individuals have contributed remarkably to this project, and I am only a mouthpiece for whatever that they have achieved during this time. So let's play this game. If I were to be doing this talk in person, what I would do is give you guys a couple of minutes and let you sort of play the spot the difference game. I am making an assumption that all of you would have played this game at some point or the other, certainly during your childhood. And if you are like me, then every so often I do play this game when it's in the newspapers or in magazines and things like that. What this game really involves is two images that are placed side by side, very, very similar looking images. And what needs to be done is to identify the differences that are there between the left and the right image. If you are playing this game amongst a bunch of people, then the winner is the person who identifies this the fastest. and also the one with the least amount of errors or the number of misses that they create. If you're playing this by yourself, then how long do you take to finish the game? How long did you take yesterday? How long are you taking today, and how long will you take tomorrow? Is sort of the metrics to track your own performance in this gameplay. So if you did play this game while I was talking about this game, then you will see that there are 6 differences that are there in the game, and here are the 6 different differences. So the first one is in the fin of the fish. This is white in color, and the corresponding area on the other image is black in color. The second is the eyebrows of the fish. There is an eyebrow that is present here and that is missing there. There is also the bubbles that are in a certain orientation here, but the orientation has become different there. The helmet of this baby fish that has the picture of a boy and no picture of the boy in the other image. Similarly, again in the helmet, this little spot or the rivet is white in color and that's black in color. And the 6 is essentially the orientation of the tail fin that is pointed upwards there and that is pointed downwards. So these are sort of the 6 differences that you would identify. And for the purposes of this particular talk and whatever I'm going to do in the later part of the talk, we will divide these differences into 3 broad categories. We will divide them as a polarity change, a polarity being it is white in one image and it has switched over to black in the other, and you can see that in difference 1 and 5. The second is a presence or absence of a feature. The eyebrow is a good example of this, or the boy's face is a good example. These features are present in the left image and the corresponding image does not contain these features. So the third is an orientation change. Differences 3 and 6 correspond to that, where the orientation of the bubbles in the left image is different from the right, and so is the tail fin. And in a minute, you will see why I am categorizing these differences into these 3 broad categories and why this is going to become important in the way we are playing this game. So if you did play the game, and traditionally how we all play the game is by looking at the left image, identifying a feature in that left image, and moving our eyes over to the other image and searching for that corresponding feature in the fellow image. So it essentially involves a searching strategy. It is a visual search task. And what you also do is you make sequential eye movements from one image to the other, and you progressively keep doing that over and over again in order to search for these differences, essentially scanning the entire image. And every time you identify a difference, you commit that to memory, and then you continue on doing the next difference. That's how traditionally the game is played. And what makes this game so laborious and interesting? Why is Spot the Difference game such a popular game during childhood or for adults? It's because we are very bad at doing this. Okay, and the idea for this comes from a very well-established paradigm in experimental psychology called the change blindness paradigm. And there are different variants of this paradigm, but they all tell you more or less the same thing. The first way of essentially the paradigm is, if I show you a scene, a visual scene, and then I show it to you again with a small difference in that scene, we are very, very bad at identifying that difference. So here is the closest to our Spot the Difference game. You have the left scene, and then you have the right scene with something that has changed. In this particular thing, the branches on top of this scene is absent here, and the individuals that are standing in the far end of the scene are again sort of absent in the fellow scene. Now, we have to, again, much like what we did in the Spot the Difference game, we moved our eyes from the left image to the right to identify that scene. A variant of that is when I show you the scene and then I flash it for a short period of time, intersperse it with a blank scene, and then again I flash the second scene, but with a change. You're again very, very poor at identifying this. In this particular sequence, if this were a movie, this image would flash and then the gray blank screen Then again, the second image would flash and then the blank again. Now, between this scene and the second presentation, something has changed in this particular picture. The image or the engine of the aircraft has been removed, and we are usually quite bad at identifying this. The third is a real-world application of this phenomena, and here is a typical scene where an individual is asking directions to a lady on the road, and while this lady is explaining the directions, these two guys on purpose, they walk between them with this with this wooden board. Now, in that process, while they are walking through, the guy who is asking for that direction changes. It's a different individual that comes in. And this lady, once the entire interaction is over, she is asked, did you notice that the person that is asking you the direction has changed? Turns out that she doesn't even identify, she doesn't even recognize that that has happened. So what is common in all of this is we are not very good at detecting change when there is a break in our conscious perception. The break in our conscious perception in this scene was with these guys walking between them with the board. In this, it was because there was a flash that had happened that did not contain any scene. And in this paradigm, it is because of the eye movements that you make from one scene to the other. In all three, what is a very continuous perception that is there in front of us, when that gets broken, you lose track of what all you are talking about. Now, there is a lot of theories behind why that happens and how does the brain gather information about the scene and so on and so forth. That's not the purpose of this particular talk. What we are going to do is try and see how can we get better at this. And before I really tell you that, there is one more very interesting experiment that I want to talk about, and this was done by Atwood et al. In 2018 in the London Museum. So what they did is they went to the museum and they identified artifacts of different kinds. Here is a block painting, here is a vase, and here is a thimble that were made several years ago, and there were 2 copies of this that were made. And then these 2 copies, because these are all handmade artifacts, there is some difference in these copies. Inherently, that happens because of the artisan cannot completely replicate what has happened. Now, what these guys did was they recruited a bunch of volunteers and asked them, are you able to identify the difference between these 2 pairs? Essentially, it is a change blindness task, but they are applying it to these museum artifacts. And here is the data that is coming out of it. Without they had 12 different pairs of artifacts, and without getting into the details of it, on an average, we are good at doing this only at about 45 to 50% of time. Essentially, we operate at chance level. Sometimes we identify it, and an equal proportion of it we are unable to identify it. So because our visual system is unable to identify any change in our perception that happens during our day-to-day activities, the spot the difference game that applies this paradigm becomes extremely challenging to play, laborious, and therefore very, very interesting. Now, just to recall what we were talking about, this is like the change blindness paradigm, the traditional way of doing it. We make eye movements and then we scan the image, and in that process, the change blindness paradigm sort of kicks in. Now, is there a way to cheat this game? And this is where our fundamental understanding of binocular vision really kicks in. Now, anyone who understands the basics of binocular vision would see that the left image and the right image are more or less similar. They are similar for the most part. And because they are similar for the most part, you can fuse them. You can actually fuse them and make a single cyclopean percept out of them. Now, if you are capable of doing cross fusion by converging your eyes, you are more than welcome to do that as you are listening to this talk, and see what happens when you actually get that cyclopean perceptor. Now, what we are going to do in the rest of this talk is try and compare what is the game performance like if you were to play it the traditional way and if you were to play it with the cheating paradigm. Now, in the cheating paradigm, we are going to call that as the fusion mode of gameplay, because we have fused the two images into a single cyclopean percept. And the non-traditional way of playing is what we are going to call as the non-fusion mode of gameplay. Now, question is, are we any better at the fusion mode of gameplay than with the non-fusion mode of gameplay? At an anecdotal level, I know that we are better at it, and I've heard a few people who do this also tell me that, hey, they are better at it, but we don't really have any evidence for it. So what Kavita and Swanandi set out to do as a part of their PGD OVS project was to really do this and try and seek an evidence for this. So for a minute, why should the fusion mode of gameplay be any better? Yes, you can fuse it. Yes, you can make a cyclopean percept out of it. But why should it be better? It should be better because the parts in the two images that are not similar to each other, for instance, the presence or absence of that image, or the change in the color from black to white in the two images, they should be unfusible, and they should result in the phenomena of binocular rivalry or lustre, luminance lustre or chromatic lustre, depending upon whether you are talking about black and white images or color images. And this rivalry or lustre is very, very immediately apparent to conscious perception. We are very, very good at picking the rivalry and lustre. So by fusing the two images and making them into a cyclopean percept, what you are doing is you are converting the task from a search task to actually a task just to identify where all do you see this lustre happening or the rivalry happening. That's all that your task has become, and therefore you should become much better at this. In case you do not have a clue of what I'm talking about, here is an example of a binocular rivalry stimulus and a binocular lustre stimulus. Once again, if you are good at cross-fusing, and if you are able to converge your eyes and fuse the left eye and the right eye image into one, what you will end up seeing is a sort of a played pattern of these gratings that are seen in the left and the right eye. Other than the circular shape of the gratings on the top and the global pattern of the square in the bottom, the individual features in these images are non-fusible, and that should stimulate a very strong sense of rivalry. What you will also notice that this rivalry is not a very stable percept. It's a very unstable, or rather a bistable percept, where the visual system is all confused about what do I now process. My left eye is giving me a different information and the right eye is giving me a completely different information. And it is now going to start confusing with each other, and it should result in into a very conflicting percept. And that conflicting percept may sometimes appear as this played pattern, might sometimes appear as only the left eye grating, or sometimes appearing as the right eye grating. Essentially, in an otherwise stationary scene, you will not see a very structured, stable pattern that is there. Rivalry, on the other hand, will actually result in shimmering. It will almost shine in your percept when you are able to fuse the left and the right eye images. Again, if you can cross fuse it, you will experience that for yourself right away. So our hypothesis is that because in the fusion mode, there should be rivalry and there should be lustre that is generated, you should be in a much better position to identify these differences than when you are playing it in the non-fusion mode of gameplay. Is that what it is? So the study hypothesis is the non-fusion mode of gameplay will be slower and more prone to errors than the fusion mode of gameplay. Now, the two outcome variables that we are going to track here is how long did it take for an individual to play this game in the two modes of gameplay, and second, how many errors did that individual make. These are the two outcome variables. And the second hypothesis is within the fusion mode. Now remember, earlier we had categorized it into three categories. You had the polarity change, you had the presence absence change, and you had the orientation change. Your polarity change should give you the most strongest experience of lustre or rivalry. The orientation will be a weaker rivalry stimulus, and the presence absence should not be very strong because there is really nothing to rival there. So there should also be differences that will happen depending upon what type of difference that you are trying to find out. So let's see if that's what happened. So the basic experiment that we did was, or rather what Kavita did, this is her brainchild. What Kavita did was she picked 30 subjects with normal binocular vision, age range between 18 and 28 years of age. She downloaded these images from the internet, modified them using Adobe Illustrator software so that they were all grayscale images, and then they all contained the set number of differences. So there were either 3, 6, 9, or 12 differences. So essentially the task became more and more complicated. 3 was an easy task and 12 was a very complicated task. And the order of presentations was all randomized across different subjects. So in total, without getting into too much of details, in total, the subject, a subject made about 288 different judgments. Now notice that every subject participated in both the fusion mode and the non-fusion mode of gameplay. They were randomized as to which one they would participate first. Some would do the non-fusion first, the others would do the fusion first. So all of that was very nicely randomized. And in the non-fusion mode, it was monocular. The non-dominant eye was occluded. In the fusion mode, it was a cyclopean viewing, and fusion was achieved using a stereo viewer, something that our glaucoma colleagues would use to see the optic nerve head, and we sort of adapted it to use for our own purposes. The subjects would identify these differences using mouse clicks on the appropriate part of the image, and we would keep track of how many of these differences they identified and how long did it take for them to identify these images. So these were the results. Now, as the task became harder, you started with 3 differences, it became 6, 9, and 12. As the task became harder and harder, the time that it took to complete the task increased. That's not surprising, obviously. You put more differences, it will take longer for people to complete it. Now, interestingly, notice that the bars that are indicated as NF are non-fusion, F is fusion, and in all cases, you see that the F bars are smaller than the NF bars. So the time it took for the fusion task to complete was shorter than the time it took for the non-fusion. The differences is shown in the inset here. For 3 differences, when you have a very simple task, the difference is only about 2 to 3 seconds, and that's not really relevant or prominent. But when the task becomes harder, you do see that you save a good 10 to 15 seconds in playing this game. And when you are in competition with someone else, finishing a game 15 seconds faster would make you a very, very clear winner. So in a 100-meter race, for instance, the differences are in the order of few 100 milliseconds. By that count, your fusion task is significantly faster than the non-fusion task is. The number of errors made is also lesser. You can see that the y-axis is the number of errors. These are the total number of differences that they had to identify in each task. And what you see is the NF bars once again are all taller than the F bars, indicating that the number of errors that they made in the fusion task is actually lesser than in the non-fusion task. So both in terms of the time that it takes for them to complete it and in terms of the number of errors that they end up making, by fusing it, you do actually make the gameplay more efficient than in the non-fusion mode. Now, so the first hypothesis that we set up, we are affirmatively confirming that the fusion mode is indeed faster and less erroneous than the non-fusion mode. What about the second hypothesis? Between these differences, again, these were 3 different categories of differences that were there. Between these 3 differences, as expected, the first identified difference was invariably the polarity one. Close to about 70 to 80% of all differences that were identified first were all the polarity. The remaining 15 to 20% was the evenly distributed between the orientation and the presence or absence. So every time you play this game, the first difference that you are likely to identify is invariably the polarity one. Now, notice that it doesn't matter whether you do this in the fusion mode or in the non-fusion mode. Polarity turns out to be the winner. But you can see that the fusion mode bars are a little higher than the non-fusion mode, meaning that when you fuse the image and play the game, the rivalry stands out or the luster stands out, and you can actually make the game, you actually identify that difference faster. So both these hypotheses are turning out to be in the direction that we expected. That's all good. We didn't really stop with that. We wanted to explore this phenomena a little bit more. And one of the things that kept bugging us was images that are downloaded from the internet. We have limited control over the target contrast or the size. They were obviously intended not for the purposes of the experiment here. They were intended for other playing purposes. So we can't really test the impact of target size or contrast. Now, the effect that I showed you is that dependent on target size and contrast. What if you vary the size of the target? Does the effect go away? Does it get more enhanced? What if you change the contrast? Does it become, does the effect change? So Swanandi came along and she did the second experiment where she created these images. She created these synthetic images again in Adobe Illustrator. You can see that she created 3 different sizes. Here is the largest size, about 5 degrees, an intermediate size 3 degrees, and here is a very small size of 1 degree. And she also created this with 4 different contrast levels, a very high contrast, close to 100% contrast, 50%, 10%, and 5% contrast. 5% contrast, for those of you who understand contrast sensitivity function, we are very close to threshold levels of performance. So you're just about able to see it. Whereas 100% contrast is what a typical high contrast logmar chart would actually have. So we varied both the contrast of the target and the size of the target, and then we did the same paradigm once more. The methodology is more or less similar to the first experiment. 20 subjects participated in it. They all had normal binocular vision. They did both the fusion mode and the non-fusion mode, again in the same randomized manner. They made 72 different judgments here because all the differences in this image contained only 6 differences. We didn't really want to overwhelm the subjects with different differences also. So whatever I'm going to talk about in the second experiment, it's all with only 6 differences. And what Swanandi found was really there is no impact. This is a 3-factor ANOVA table that is shown here, where contrast of the target did not have any impact, significance is 0.2, size did not have any impact, whereas the task did have an impact. Fusion was faster once more at all contrast levels and all sizes compared to the non-fusion mode. Interaction between these variables were also not statistically significant. So essentially, the superiority of the fusion mode of gameplay continues to be better even in the irrespective of the target contrast or the target size. Now, what about color? The differences that you see is not always in black and white. That's what we chose in the first experiment and second experiment. But what about color? Does color create an impact on the way we play the game? Now, color is a much more complicated stimulus compared to just luminance, and the complicatedness is shown here in the form of the CIE color diagram. Now, as far as color vision is concerned, a pure white is right smack in the center there, what's called D65. Now, there are 3 attributes to color, as you would have learned in your basic optometry school. There is hue, there is saturation, and there is chroma. Chroma is the intensity of the wavelength of light, and the saturation is how far away are you from the center point. So we wanted to study the impact of both the saturation and the chroma in this experiment. And once again, we went back to our synthetic images. Amit sort of helped us out with this experiment. Kavita again created these images. And what she did was she picked 3 different saturations, 50, 75, 4 different saturations, I'm sorry, 50, 75, 12.5%, and 5% saturation. So high saturation would be in the edges of this color diagram, and low saturation will be very close to the color diagram. And we chose colors in the 2 opposing axes, red-green color axis, 2 red-green color axis, and 1 blue-yellow color axis. So the way we did this was we would pick an image along the red-green axis, and if there is one image on this end of the red axis, there would be another image on the other end of the x-axis. So the distance between the colors from the white point was always constant. And therefore, when you fuse them, they should create a very strong effect of chromatic luster, not luminous luster, but chromatic luster. And is that what, does that really make an impact? Does the fusion mode continue to survive? Exactly the same experiment, but now instead of black and white stimuli, these guys looked at it in color stimuli, and we found out what was the effect. Exactly the same effect as the second experiment. Only the task is significant. The fusion is significantly better than the non-fusion. On an average, you are looking at about 8 to 10 seconds of the task becoming faster. It doesn't matter what color saturation that you are dealing with, doesn't matter what hue angle that you are dealing with. So in summary, what we have been able to show in these three experiments is reiterating the fact that the spot the difference game is a very challenging one. And secondly, the traditional mode of gameplay can be made faster and less erroneous through binocular fusion. And why? Because of the binocular rivalry or the luster issue. Orientation, because of that, whenever there is a polarity difference between the two images, be it a luminance polarity or a chromatic polarity, they are very, very readily appreciable. Orientation and the other differences, presence or absence, does not really have as strong of an effect as the polarity one. And again, the impact of the fusion mode of gameplay continues to remain irrespective of target size, contrast, or the chromaticity. Now, we are still not very happy. Now, despite doing these three experiments, systematically looking at various properties of the stimulus, we are still not very happy because there is one small assumption that we have made, and we want to sort of address that assumption. The assumption that we have made is all of the differences that we are seeing is indeed because of binocular rivalry or luster. I kept telling you that over and over during the presentation, but it is an assumption. I have really not tested that assumption. So we are currently setting up an experiment to actually test that. Now, how do we do this? We go back to the literature and we look at a fantastic paper by Stuart Anstis in 2000, who was looking at different patterns of images that would actually produce binocular luster. Now, what he was able to show very dramatically is from the background luminance, only if the two images have opposite polarities. Notice here that it is a gray background. This is a darker polarity. This is a lighter polarity. Only that kind of an image will give you very strong luster. Any of the others where both are bright or both are dark does not result in luster. This is data from his paper, and we are able to use this phenomena to try and for our purposes. So what we want to do is create these differences where some differences have this kind of opposite polarity, others have these kinds of differences. So then you are playing it in the non-fusion mode, these differences should be apparent. But when you're playing it in the fusion mode, luster will only show up for differences that contain this. Luster should not show up for the others. So in fact, you are weakening the luster cue. And this is an example of a stimulus that we have created. Patterns 1, 2, and 3 are the ones that we call as a luster enhanced stimulus, like the ones that we had used in the previous one. Notice here that the background is gray, this is lighter than gray, and this is darker than gray, and therefore it should result in a very strong impression of luster. Whereas differences 4, 5, and 6 should not have any impact, because notice here that both are brighter. They are different, but both are brighter, and they should not create a luster stimulus. So our hypothesis there is only the luster enhanced stimuli will be able to be picked. The luster weakened ones you will not be able to pick, if indeed luster is the reason why these games are being played so fast. So Like I said, this is an experiment in progress. We still do not have results for this, and owing to the COVID-19 pandemic that we are in the middle of, it is becoming difficult to collect more data. So, but that's what it is. That's what we are dealing with, and hopefully in the next few months we should have some data to actually show this effect as well. So with that, I will conclude. And if you are in the mood of having some fun, just go to Google and search for Spot the Difference for Kids. You will see tons and tons of these kinds of images, colored, black and white versions and whatnot. And if you want to win the game from your friends, then fuse it and play it faster and with less errors. With that, I will stop. And if there is any questions, I'm happy to take that. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shrikant, for such a wonderful session. Now we are to move to our discussion session. Are you ready to take the questions, Doctor?
Sure.
Yeah, I'll be reading out for you. Our first question goes as, people with two eyes can fuse the two images and they can spot the difference. But for people with one eye, fusion is not possible. Is there any
Absolutely.
way to cheat this game for one-eyed people?
I mean, that's a great question, and there is a couple of answers to this question. The direct answer to his or her question is, if you are one-eyed, then unfortunately you don't experience binocularity. Whatever I do, you will not be able to experience it. So you will have to play it in the traditional non-fusion mode only. I can't think of a way that you will get the luster in this kind of a gameplay. But having said that, the alternate answer or alternate possibility that we are currently talking about is, can this be used as a way to test the intensity of amblyopia that may exist? Now, this is a game. This is a fun thing for children to actually play. And if they are indeed amblyopic and to some level of amblyopia, they should not be able to see any of this luster or fusion. Now, once they are going through vision therapy and the various kinds of therapy that enhances their binocularity, the fusion mode of gameplay should actually become better and better. So can this be used very remotely as a possibility of tracking progress of vision therapy in amblyopia? So essentially, an amblyope is an eye that is monocular, a very deep amblyope. And as they go through the vision therapy, when binocularity is coming back, can this game be used as a marker for testing the extent of binocularity? I hope I have answered that person's question.
Okay, it was indeed a great answer, sir. Moving forward, why specifically Adobe Illustrator software is used for creating the images? Why not any other software?
The practical answer is, we have access to Adobe Illustrator, and you should be able. We are very familiar with using Adobe Illustrator. It is also a fairly powerful software in that you can manipulate a lot of things related to the contrast or the chromaticity of the stimuli using Illustrator. The other software I suppose one could use is, the only thing that I can think of is PowerPoint. But the color rendition, especially if you are doing chromatic experiments or the contrast, if you are doing luminance based experiments, is not great in PowerPoint. So you got to be cautious with what you are doing. The other point that I should also mention, which slipped my mind, is, even though we created these stimuli using Adobe Illustrator and stuff, the contrast or the color with which it is presented on the screen totally depends upon the monitor's monitor status. So we have used monitors that were both luminance calibrated and color calibrated, and so we are therefore fairly sure that when we say it is a 5% contrast stimulus, it is indeed a 5% contrast stimulus.
Okay, thanks so much for your answers, Dr. Shrikant. Moving forward, can we do methodology test in children?
Say that again. Methodology test in children.
Methodology test, yeah.
You mean using this paradigm?
I mean, actually the questions might be addressing that can we do this method test in children?
Yeah, I suppose you could. I mean, we haven't tested it. We have done it all on adults. These are typical optometry students or young staff. If we go the route of this amblyopia thing that I was talking about earlier, then the obvious thing to do is to test it out on children. I have a 5-year-old at home, and I could try to run it on him and then see what he has to say. So that will be my first experimental subject.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, these are only the questions till now. We
Yep.
will be waiting just for a few minutes if anyone is willing to ask. Okay, doctor, these are only the questions for today.
Okay.
Considering the time limit, here I announce the closure of the discussion session, and I would like to thank you all for coming up with your queries and making the discussion session interactive. I would again like to express my immense gratitude towards our presenter, Dr. Shrikant, for his wonderful insights. Before wrap up, I request our today's presenter to share his few words to our program.
Well, thank you, Solu, for organizing this. Like I said earlier, I think it's a wonderful effort by all of you guys. We do see a lot of students and they're from Nepal coming in, and wonderful cohort, very, very smart students and staff. And it's been a pleasure interacting with all of them. And now I get to talk to you guys, as Nepalese optometry group. So again, I congratulate you on this effort and wish you all the best for more such sessions in the future.
Thank you so much, Doctor. It's our immense pleasure to have you with us today, and we would love to see you again in the future.
Okay, thank you so much. Can I stop sharing my slides?
Yeah, Doctor.
Okay, thank
Herewith,
you.
I announce the closure of today's webinar, hoping to see you all again tomorrow. Stay safe, stay connected. Thank you.